Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Walala Nal Susid. An act respecting the development of a national strategy to redress environmental racism could also be called, in short, a National Strategy to Redress Environmental Racism Act. Environmental racism can be defined as the disproportionate number of environmentally hazardous sites established in areas inhabited primarily by members of Indigenous and other racialized communities. The enactment requires the Minister of the Environment, in consultation with representatives of provincial and municipal governments, Indigenous communities, and other affected communities, in order to develop a national strategy to promote efforts across Canada to redress the harm caused by environmental racism. It also provides for reporting requirements in relation to the strategy. And, Mr. Speaker, I did introduce a bill similar to this in Nova Scotia several years ago. It reached a second reading and we debated it on the floor of the House, and at that point people in Nova Scotia started to understand what exactly environmental racism is. Since then there's been a book about it called There's Something in the Water by Dr. Ingrid Waldron, and there is now a movie by Ellen Page, a documentary, which will soon be seen on Netflix. So I look forward to hearing debate in the House, and I would hope that all parties will support this important bill going forward. Thank you.
Mrs. Zahn, seconded by Ms. May, Sandwich Gulf Islands, moves that the bill be now read a first time and be printed. The motion is deemed adopted.
First reading of this bill, première lecture de ce projet de loi.
Shall the bill be read a second time at the next sitting?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The land is our mother. So when we lose value for the land, people lose value for the women. Thus says Vanessa Gray of Amjinang First Nation, Ontario, and I agree. It's also my firm belief that, like systemic racism, environmental racism is something that's been ignored for far too many years, and the time has come for us to act to redress the problems of the past and make sure they don't continue. Surely it should be enshrined as a human right for all Canadians to have clean air, water, and earth. I first became aware of the issue of environmental racism 5 years ago when I first met Dr. Ingrid Waldron, a professor at Dalhousie University in Halifax in the School of Nursing, at a coffee shop in Halifax near the provincial legislature where I worked as an MLA. At that time, Dr. Waldron explained what her research and data gathering was proving about the reality of environmental racism in Nova Scotia. I suggested that creating a legislative bill to address the issue would be a help at that point in time and bring it to public awareness and to the floor of government in Nova Scotia. Dr. Waldron and I worked together for several weeks on my very first private member's bill, Bill 111, the Environmental Racism Protection Act, which I introduced in Province House in 2015. Later on, Dr. Waldron wrote a book entitled There's Something in the Water, which highlights environmental racism in Black and Indigenous communities across Nova Scotia, and she recently partnered with Nova Scotian actor Elliot Page to create the 2019 documentary based on that book. Upon my arrival in Ottawa as an MP a year ago, my first personal order of business was to introduce a similar bill, but this time as a national strategy in order to address environmental racism across Canada. The scope of Bill C-230 is therefore broader and more comprehensive than my original provincial bill. Bill C-230 would collect data including socioeconomic circumstances, physical and mental effects of communities affected by environmental racism across this land. These effects are wide-ranging, from skin rashes and upset stomachs to more serious ailments like respiratory illness, including asthma, cardiovascular disease, reproductive morbidity, including preterm births, and babies born with Down syndrome, as well as cancers that disproportionately impact women. There is evidence that many chronic diseases in Indigenous communities, for instance, are not primarily due to genetics or internal factors, but instead to external factors, what is in the air, in the water, in our environment. I'd like to personally thank the member of Saanich Gulf Islands at this time for seconding Bill C-230, and I suggest that this is an example of what Canadians truly want to see in their government, especially in these dangerous times. Parliamentarians working together. I'd like to thank Drs. David Suzuki and the Suzuki Foundation, the Blue Dot Movement, and the Enrich Project for their endorsement and support for this vital bill. And I'd also like to acknowledge and thank Dr. Ingrid Waldron for her passion, dedication, research, assiduous study, and for sharing her notes for me this evening, because environmental racism and its effects on racialized communities needs to be heard by everybody. So, Mr. Speaker, as MP for Cumberland Colchester, I would like to explain what environmental racism is. It refers to the disproportionate location and greater exposure of Indigenous, Black, and other racialized communities to polluting industries and other environmental hazards. These toxic burdens have been linked to high rates of cancer, as I've said, and other health problems in these communities. From the decision approximately 60 years ago to offload pulp mill effluent into Pictou Landing First Nations' once pristine boat harbor, and toxic landfills and dumps placed in the African Nova Scotian communities of Shelburne, Lincolnville, and Africville, to mercury contamination in Grassy Narrows First Nation, petrochemical facilities in Chemical Valley in Ontario and in British Columbia, and the legacy of environmental racism really can no longer be ignored. Bill C-230 is asking the Minister of Environment and Climate Change to develop a strategy that must include measures to examine the link between race, socioeconomic status, and environmental risk. Collect by environmental racism. Assess the administration and enforcement of environmental laws in each province, and address environmental racism, including in relation to possible amendments to federal laws, policies, and programs, the involvement of community groups in environmental policymaking, compensation for individuals or communities, ongoing funding for affected communities, and access of affected communities to clean air and water. Mr. Speaker, I would contend that Indigenous and Black women have been building grassroots environmental and social justice movements for decades to challenge the legal, political, and corporate agendas that sanction and enable environmental racism and other forms of colonial violence in their communities. Colonial gendered violence continues today and includes the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, the displacement of Indigenous people from their lands by corporate resource extraction projects, anti-Black and anti-Indigenous police violence, and other forms of state-sanctioned violence that make it difficult for Indigenous and Black peoples and women to meet their basic needs with respect to employment, income, healthcare, and other resources. Colonialization and genocide are tied to the intersections of Indigenous lands and bodies. Women experience violence because they are the ones that are responsible for taking care of the land and holding it for future generations. Therefore, gendered violence that harms women specifically also harms nations, which makes it easier to take possession of the land. For Indigenous women specifically, production and reproduction, land and life, resistance and survival are all intimately connected. There is no separation. Therefore, the Indigenous role in fighting against environmental racism by defending their land and territory and protecting their water are acts of resistance against gendered oppression. So, what is environmental racism exactly? How do we define it? Environmental racism is racial discrimination in the disproportionate location and greater exposure of Indigenous and racialized communities to contamination and pollution from polluting industries and other environmentally hazardous activities, as I said, but also in the lack of political power these communities have for resisting the placement of industrial polluters in their communities. In the implementation of policies that sanction the harmful and in many cases life-threatening presence of poisons in these communities. In the disproportionate negative impacts of environmental policies that result in differential rates of cleanup of environmental contaminants in these communities, and in the history of excluding Indigenous and racialized communities from mainstream environmental groups, decision-making boards, commissions, and regulatory bodies. And I would also say in the feminist movement. The health effects of environmental racism in Canada. Wow, the health risks associated include, as I've said, all of these various different types of serious illnesses. And studies provide evidence that health effects of environmental racism are both gendered and racialized and impact Indigenous women in specific ways, most notably the impacts on reproductive health. One of the most significant ways that environmental racism impacts Indigenous women specifically is through the detrimental health effects of toxic contaminants that include high levels of toxins in breast milk, placenta cord blood, blood serum, body fat, as well as infertility, miscarriages, premature births, premature menopause, reproductive system cancers, and an inability to produce healthy children due to compromised endocrine and immune systems while in utero. This bill, Bill C-230, is important, Mr. Speaker. Why is it important? It would play a significant role in addressing the legacy of environmental racism in Canada and ensure that these communities have access to clean air and water, which all Canadians have a right to. It would also help address environmental health inequities in Indigenous and Black communities that are outcomes of these communities' proximity to environmental contamination and pollution. It's up to those with power and not the people impacted by environmental racism to address the problem. Those who have the most influence and the strongest voice need to be part of the solution. It's important that all communities have the power to control their environment, Mr. Speaker. Currently, Indigenous, Black, and other racialized communities, non-white communities, don't have that power. And when they don't have a say in what happens in their communities, we all suffer. Bill C-230 addresses this imbalance of power and benefits everyone. It's good for all of us. It's good for Canada. It would provide an opportunity for the communities most affected by environmental racism to be involved in environmental policymaking. Mr. Speaker, according to a Lincolnville resident in Nova Scotia, who is mentioned in Dr. Waldron's book, There's Something in the Water, they say community members have experienced worsening health since the first generation landfill that was placed in their community in 1974, including increased rates of cancer and diabetes. This person says, if you look at the health of the community prior to 1974, before the landfill site was located in our community seemed to be healthier. From 1974 on till the present day, we noticed our people's health seems to be going downhill. Our people seem to be passing on at a younger age. They're contracting different types of cancer that we never heard of prior to 1974. Stomach cancer seems to be on the rise. Our people end up with tumors in their bodies. And we're at a loss of, What's causing it? The municipality says there's no way that it's the landfill that's affecting us, but if the landfill site located in other areas is having an effect on people's health, shouldn't it be the landfill site located next to our community that's having an impact on our health too? Mr. Speaker, perhaps no other African Canadian community has served as more of a classic example and symbol of both gentrification and environmental racism than Africville, the former Black community on the shores of the Bedford Basin. By 1965, the city of Halifax embarked on an urban renewal campaign resulting in the forcible displacement of its residents, resulting in the area becoming the host for a number of environmental and social hazards, such as a fertilizer plant, a slaughterhouse, a tar factory, a stone and coal crushing plant, a cotton factory, a prison, 3 systems of railway tracks, and an open dump. Mr. Speaker, I ask that all members of the House support this bill. Let's be a first. Let's make this something we can all be proud of, and let's do this for the people of Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much. And I do want to thank the committee. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And thank you for your comments in the House for first and second reading. Very interesting comments. I'd also like to thank Dr. Waldron for being here today, because she really has been the inspiration for me for presenting this bill. Bill C-230, a national strategy to redress environmental racism. Colleagues, like systemic racism, environmental racism is something that sadly has been part of the fabric of Canada for too many years. Environmental racism refers to the fact that communities of color are disproportionately burdened with health hazards due to policies and practices that have been forced upon them to live in proximity to sources of toxic waste, such as dumps, toxic waste sites, sewage works, mines, landfills, power stations, chemical plants, major roads, and emitters of airborne particulate matter. As a result, these communities suffer greatly, and they suffer greater rates of health problems attendant on hazardous pollutants. Although the term environmental racism seems new to some, it was actually coined in 1982 by African-American civil rights leader Benjamin Chavez, who described it as, and I quote, racial discrimination in environmental policymaking, the enforcement of regulations and laws, the deliberate targeting of communities of color for toxic waste facilities, the official sanctioning of the life-threatening presence of poisons and pollutants in our communities, and the history of excluding people of color from leadership of the ecology movements. Public awareness has grown about this issue in the last number of years, and there's no doubt in my mind that the time has come for government to act, both to acknowledge and address the issue. Surely we owe this to all Canadians. I'm sure that as lawmakers, we all can agree that it is a human right for all Canadians to have clean air and water in their communities, and I know our government is working very hard to make sure that that happens. I did become aware of this issue only about 7 years ago when I first met Dr. Ingrid Waldron, when she explained what her research and data collecting was proving about the existence of environmental racism in Nova Scotia. And if anyone still questions the reality of environmental racism, I really recommend Dr. Waldron's book, There's Something in the Water, or watch the Netflix documentary based on the book. The short summary of the bill requires that the Minister of Environment, in consultation with representatives of provincial and municipal governments, of Indigenous communities and other affected communities, to develop a national strategy to promote efforts across Canada to redress the harm caused by environmental racism. It also provides for reporting requirements in relation to the strategy, and it would collect data including socioeconomic circumstances, physical and mental effects of communities across Canada that are affected by environmental racism. We know that these effects are wide-ranging, from skin rashes and upset stomachs to more serious ailments like respiratory illness, cardiovascular disease, reproductive morbidity, including preterm births, and babies born with Down syndrome. as well as various cancers that disproportionately affect women. There's evidence that many chronic diseases in Indigenous communities, for instance, are not primarily due to genetics or internal factors, but actually to external factors, what's in the air, in the water, in our environment. I'm grateful to members who have already supported my bill thus far, including the member from Saanich Gulf Islands who seconded Bill C-230. And I would suggest that this is an example of what Canadians truly want to see in their government, especially in these dangerous times. Parliamentarians working together to improve life for all Canadians. Bill C-230 is a bill that would make Canada an international leader in addressing environmental, social, and public health issues that impact Indigenous, Black, and other racialized and vulnerable communities from coast to coast to coast. This issue has become even more urgent, I would say, in light of the growing public awareness of systemic racism and the epidemic of racism, misogyny, gender-based violence, and femicide that the COVID-19 pandemic has stoked, since it has disproportionately impacted vulnerable communities. So please do the right thing, colleagues, and support Bill C-230. The strategy must include measures to examine the link between race and socioeconomic status and environmental risk, collect information and statistics relating to the location of environmental hazards, collect information and statistics relating to negative health outcomes in communities that have been affected, and assess the administration and enforcement of environmental laws in each province, as well as addressing environmental racism, including relation to possible amendments to federal laws, policies, and programs, the involvement of community groups in environmental policymaking, and compensation for individuals or communities, ongoing funding for affected communities, and access of affected communities to clean air and water. So with that, colleagues, I will leave it, and
Thank you.
Dr. Waldron will continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Waldron. The screen is yours.
Dear members of the Environment and Sustainability Committee, I would like to thank you for inviting me to speak to Bill C-230 and environmental racism more broadly. I would like to begin by addressing arguments, persistent arguments over the years that since race is not a biological fact, systemic racism could not possibly exist in Canada. Indeed, it is the case that race is neither genetically programmed nor a biological fact. For example, there are no genetic characteristics possessed by all Black people, but not by non-Black people. There is no gene or cluster of genes common to all white people, but not to non-white people. Different races are not marked by important differences in gene frequencies. However, while race is not a biological fact, it is a fact that race has been and continues to be used to categorize and divide people based on physical traits such as skin color, hair texture, facial features, etc., and to include and exclude based on these physical traits. Society is racialized, and race is part of that social reality. Race developed over the years as a principle of social organization and identity formation. Humans create divisions and produce racial categories. Race has social currency and is used as a basis to deny certain groups access to various resources, services, and opportunities. Systemic racism is indeed a reality in Canada and around the world. Systemic racism refers to the laws, rules, and norms woven into our social systems that result in the unequal distribution of resources, such as the denial of access, participation, and equity to racialized people for services such as education, employment, and housing. Racism, systemic racism, manifests in the policies, practices, and procedures within our systems that may directly or indirectly promote, sustain, or entrench differential advantage or privilege for people of certain races. In other words, race is a material reality. I should know, I am Black, that has consequences for people on the ground. The material reality and consequences of racism for Indigenous, Black, and other racialized groups in Canada include higher rates of unemployment, higher rates of income insecurity, higher rates of poverty, segregation in poor neighborhoods, poorer health outcomes, disproportionate exposure to environmental hazards due to the placement of dangerous projects by government. Environmental racism, then, is a form of systemic racism because it manifests in environmental policymaking and decision-making in ways that disproportionately burden certain communities through the placement or siting of environmentally dangerous projects in their communities. Why is Bill C-230 important? It is urgent that we address over 70 years of environmental racism that has disproportionately impacted those communities. Communities whose social and economic well-being and health have already been compromised by long-standing structural determinants of health, such as unemployment and underemployment, over-policing and over-incarceration, income insecurity and poverty, food insecurity, and housing insecurity. Bill C-230 would provide the government with a framework to examine how race, socioeconomic status, and residence in remote areas that are near environmental hazards intersect to shape health outcomes in these communities. Bill C-230 would also provide affected communities with opportunities to be involved in environmental policy making and decision making, which they have been excluded from. It is important that the communities that are most burdened by the siting of hazardous projects in their communities be given opportunities to have a say in what happens in their communities. In conclusion, it is important to state that in the case of environmental policymaking, a rising tide does not lift all boats. The approach to environmental policymaking in Canada has reflected a kind of universalism that suggests that if environmental burdens experienced by all Canadians are addressed, those who are most affected by those burdens will benefit. The notion that environmental policy should not focus on specific racial groups dismisses the long history of placing these hazardous projects in our most vulnerable communities. It is an approach that has failed since polluting industries continue to be disproportionately located in these same communities. The truth is, policies work best when they are strategic and directly target the social ills in communities that are most affected. Therefore, it is crucial that we have legislation that centers race in environmental policy making and decision making, since the communities that are disproportionately harmed are those that are racialized. And once again, race is real. It has material realities. My hope then is that Bill C-230 is that legislation.
This is an exciting day for me. So thank you so much for allowing me to speak today. I feel quite humbled. I've never spoke in this environment before. I'm a retiree. I didn't know what to put in terms of what I do. A long-term activist.
Monsieur le Président.
Oui.
Mr. Chair,
Oui, est-ce que la traduction...
are you not receiving interpretation? No, I apologize for interrupting you, Ms. Jones, but the interpreter is saying that the microphone is too far from their mouth, from Dr. Jones's mouth.
bring the mic pretty close to your... yes, that might be a bit better. Okay, let's try again. We'll start the clock again. Go ahead.
My apologies to the interpreters. Is this better?
I haven't heard any objections yet. So yes, it sounds like it is.
Thank you so much. I was saying that it's really exciting, and I'm quite humbled to be able to speak today. I didn't know what to put in terms of my introduction to you. I'm now retired, or they say I'm retired, but I'm not really, because my activism continues. In speaking today on this bill, I guess I have a bit of a sadness. And the sadness is that we've been so long as activists trying to bring the issues of our communities to the forefront. And here we are again, but this is exciting. I'm happy. Now we've made it to the national level, and I'm hoping for success. I was looking at this bill and looking at the word redress. And we have a saying in our community that says, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And so by saying redress, that means there's something broken, and we've come to you to help us to fix it. I come from the African Nova Scotian community, long-term in Nova Scotia, which is the original African people of Canada. And in doing that, I presently am sitting at my family homestead, and I don't know if many of you know Truro, Nova Scotia. So I thought the best way of talking about environmental racism is just to look out my window and try to tell you the story of this little community in which I sit at the moment. I know some of you have a hard time getting your head around why do we need this special environmental racism bill for these communities? And it's because of that word disproportionate that's in Bill C-230. It doesn't mean to say that environmental degradation doesn't happen in all different communities, but it is disproportionate that it happens in our community. This little community of Truro has 3 traditional Black communities, and they're nicknamed the Island, the Marsh, and the Hill. And on the island, it had a dump many years ago, even beginning before my time. And the Black community had to deal with all the atrocities that went along with that. The white community ended up that they started to move into closer to our traditional communities. And they said, this dump has to go. We're not having it in our backyard. So imagine where they decided to move the dump. They moved it to another Black area of the town, which we called the Hill. And where that original dump was, there was never any cleanup. There was never any encasement. And today, our children play on a playground that sits on that dump that's never been dealt with. From my community on the marsh, it was a traditional Black community, which is now gentrified. There's only 3 families, Black families, that are left in this community where we were forced to live because of the racism of the day. And part of that has to do with the effect of the flooding that has taken place in this community. And with the flooding and the lack of adequate housing and resources, the Black community is all but disappeared. Like I said, there's only 3 families left. Because as new people came into the community, not from our community, they were able to have all the resources that go along with building and flood proofing and not having to deal with all the degradation that the Black community has. This bill, it asks only that you collaborate and develop a strategy on how to deal with this disproportionate impact that is still affecting our Black and Indigenous communities today. We're asking for redress. I'm proud to say I'm also a former trade union activist, and on the Canadian Labour Congress, I can remember many years ago introducing environmental racism to what was called a National Anti-Racism Task Force report. The Canadian Labour Congress, too, had trouble getting their heads around what is this thing, environmental racism, and why should you have special or distinct kind of clauses that go along with it?
Well, in fact, the work that you've done you're right. The term is new to many people, and it has begun to get some attention because of your work, which has inspired Bill C-230. Unfortunately, we're over time for this particular portion of the meeting, but I'm sure you will have many questions and many opportunities to add to your comments. Dr. Jones, and
thank you so much.
The story you told really brings the issue into high relief. So we'll go now to the David Suzuki Foundation to Lisa Gu, Manager National Policy. You have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the invitation to join you today. I'm joining you from Ottawa on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I want to begin by acknowledging that horrific events in recent weeks have put a spotlight on racism in Canada, past and present. The discovery of unmarked burial sites of 215 children on the grounds of the Kamloops Indian Residential School, and the murder of a Muslim family in London, Ontario, targeted because of their faith. Bill C-230 is a starting point to address the environmental dimension of systemic racism in Canada. This is both timely and long overdue. We appreciate the committee resuming its consideration of Bill C-230 this week and urge you to favorably report the bill before the summer recess. I'm grateful for the insights that Dr. Jones just shared and would also refer you back to Dr. Ingrid Waldron's presentation to the committee on April 14th. Dr. Waldron's research into environmental racism in Canada and the conceptual framework she presented to you informs the David Suzuki Foundation's perspectives on Bill C-230. Mr. Chair, you just noted that the term environmental racism is new to many people, and this may, in fact, be the first time this committee has considered legislation on environmental racism, although I can't be sure. However, it's worth noting that many of the measures prescribed by Bill C-230 mirror legal requirements in the US that have been in place for a quarter century. I will give a brief overview of the US requirements because it highlights the gap in Canadian environmental law and governance, a gap that Bill C-230 would start to fill. The US Executive Order on Federal Actions to Address Environmental Justice in Minority Populations and Low-Income Populations dates back to 1994. It was issued by President Clinton and has been upheld to varying degrees by successive Republican and Democratic administrations. The order directs every federal agency to, and I quote, make achieving environmental justice part of its mission, end quote, and develop and report on environmental justice strategies. These strategies must identify and address any disproportionate adverse health or environmental effects of government programs, policies, and activities on minority populations and low-income populations. The order also mandates collection of information on health and environmental risks based on race, origin, and income. Broadly speaking, Bill C-230 would establish parallel requirements in Canada for the first time with respect to the key provisions in this bill. That is the development of a national strategy on environmental racism and mandatory requirements for that strategy to include an examination of the link between race, socioeconomic status, and environmental risk, collection of information relating to the location of environmental hazards, possible amendments to federal laws, policies, and programs, and the involvement of community groups in environmental policy making. The U.S. executive order goes farther, though, establishing a high-level interagency working group on environmental justice, comprising the heads of 11 federal agencies as well as the White House to support a whole-of-government approach. The Canadian equivalent might be a permanent cabinet committee or interministerial working group. Also, within the U.S. EPA, the equivalent to Environment and Climate Change Canada, an Office of Environmental Justice provides functional capacity to deliver the agency's environmental justice strategy. The Office of Environmental Justice also offers technical and financial assistance to communities, as well as environmental justice-related policy guidance, tools, and training for EPA officials. The office supports data collection and an integrated research agenda, and it's a focal point for collaboration with researchers, community organizations, and state and local governments. Recently, President Biden has put environmental justice at the center of his environmental agenda. In March, the White House appointed a new Environmental Justice Advisory Council to provide advice on updating the 1994 executive order to address current and historic environmental injustices. Bill C-230 offers an opportunity for alignment with the U.S. at a time of renewed commitment to bilateral environmental action. The David Suzuki Foundation urges all parties to support Bill C-230 and to work to buttress it with supporting governance structures and investments. And in this regard, I would draw to the committee's attention the brief submitted by the Green Budget Coalition, of which the David Suzuki Foundation is a member, recommending investments to establish a Canadian Office of Environmental Justice and Equity with funding to develop a strategy on environmental racism as an early deliverable. In closing, the David Suzuki Foundation has long advocated for legal recognition of the right to a healthy environment and the integration of human rights and equity considerations in environmental decision-making. Bill C-230 is an important step in this direction.
Thank you, Ms. Gu. And we'll go now to Dr. McDonald for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the invitation to appear today to speak to this critically important bill to develop a national strategy to redress environmental racism. And as Lisa already spoke to, the horrific occurrences of the last few weeks have made it even more apparent how desperately we as a society need to address all forms of systemic racism within our country. I'm joining you for the traditional territories of several First Nations, including the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewas, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. EcoJustice is Canada's largest environmental law charity. We work on behalf of individuals, communities, and First Nations and other non-governmental organizations to advocate for stronger environmental laws in Canada. EcoJustice is committed to Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action towards reconciliation with all Indigenous communities, and we are embedding a focus on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in all aspects of our organization. I will start by building on Mrs. Gu's remarks about the U.S. Executive Order on Environmental Justice. Following the executive order, the US EPA developed an environmental justice screening and mapping tool, or EJ Screen for short. Similar to the analysis mandated in Bill C-230, EJ Screen exposes the substantive inequalities of environmental hazards and risk impacting racialized communities across the United States. EJ Screen combines demographics with environmental data to calculate environmental justice indices at the census block level, data such as concentrations of air pollutants, proximity to hazardous waste sites, proximity to wastewater pollution discharges, cancer risk from exposure to hazardous air pollutants, and more are mapped and available to anyone with an internet connection. Communities, industries, and regulators all use EJ Screen for various purposes. For example, regulators use it to assess environmental and human health impacts at the community level, and communities access the analysis to redress environmental racism and push back against environmental racism. To demonstrate this point, I pulled some information from EJ Screen on an area near New Orleans, infamously known as Cancer Alley, near a cluster of refineries and chemical plants. EJ Screen shows that this community is almost entirely low-income people of color. They are at the 99th percentile, among the highest in the US for cancer risk from inhalation of air toxics, and similarly high for proximity to wastewater pollution discharges. That is just some of the information compiled and analyzed on the risk and hazards from pollution and toxic substances. Other hazards such as coastal flooding from climate change are also available through EJ Screen. Finding similar information on impacted communities in Canada is near impossible. For example, in the area known as Chemical Valley near Sarnia, Ontario, a cluster of refineries and petrochemical plants surround the Aamjiwnaang First Nation Reserve. While visiting homes within the Aamjiwnaang First Nation, I have seen how close the industry is, and I've smelled, tasted, and felt the pollution in my throat and in my eyes. I recognize my privilege when I return to my home in Toronto. The only federal environmental database on pollution in Canada is the very limited National Pollutant Release Inventory, NPRI for short. And as the title indicates, all the NPRI provides is information on pollution releases from industrial sources and other facilities. There's no demographic information, no assessment of impacts on communities. Therefore, it is not a tool in its present form that can be used to assess and work towards substantive equality. The data analysis mandated by C-230, particularly in subsections 3A and B, could start to fill this urgent need in Canada. That is why EcoJustice fully supports the bill and recommends that it be passed by all parties, and that the data and analysis be publicly available so that everyone, including other governments, may use it to inform decisions that impact racialized and Indigenous people. However, if there is an interest in strengthening the bill, EcoJustice has some recommendations for additional provisions. We recommend an amendment to set out an obligation for the Government of Canada to take all necessary measures to ensure that environmental assessments and risk assessments under federal laws identify potential impacts on Indigenous and racialized people, and ensure approvals, permits, licenses, and other federal decisions do not perpetuate, intensify, or exacerbate environmental racism. In addition, we recommend that the bill include a low-risk, low-barrier legal mechanism for individuals and communities to enforce an alleged failure of that obligation. The last point I want to make is that I'm very familiar with Bill C-28 to amend SEPA, and I can reassure the committee members that C-230 is entirely complementary to C-28. C-28 lays out the foundations for recognizing the right to healthy environment and the administration of SEPA and requires consideration of vulnerable populations, but it does not mandate the collection and analysis of data on environmental racism as prescribed by C-230, nor does C-28 contain a specific focus on environmental racism. Both bills are needed and long overdue. We should thank the committee for their time and happy to try and answer any questions you